All right, I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's Talmud class. The class is sponsored by the Susser Foundation, the Skiba family, the Sheeran family, and in memory of Libby and Harold Grill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith, for the introduction. And tonight we will have the opportunity to study together about musical instruments on Shabbat and on Yom Tov. And we will see different opinions and attitudes about it. Before we get to the halachic material, before we get to the technicities, I would love to hear a little bit about your feelings about instruments on Shabbat, because I think this is also very important. We will get to the technical material, and we have a lot of sources to read and to study together tonight. But before we get there, let me know a little bit about your feelings on instrumentation on Shabbat, on instrumental music on Shabbat. I don't want to say music on Shabbat, because music on Shabbat we do, we always did. The question is whether we use instruments on Shabbat. And before we get to the sources, I would love to hear 1, 2, or 3 opinions, in case you are ready to share them with us.
I'll share.
Marty, please.
Hi, Rabbi. I don't particularly care for it. I'm not offended by it, but I feel like I'm in a church when I have musical instruments.
Perfect.
But I also feel like I'm in a church when certain English translations of Hebrew songs are sung in English. I feel like I'm in a church too. So it's not just the instruments.
Perfect. So it is very helpful. Thank you so much, Marty. So one class of argument will be in the direction of it doesn't look Jewish, it doesn't sound Jewish, or maybe it doesn't sound conservative Judaism. And some people will associate musical instruments on Shabbat with the Reform movement, but not with the conservative movement. So Marty, what you say is very helpful and helps us to start this conversation. And we will see that this is also something that we will see in Halakha. Are we allowed or not to use something that resembles different religions, that somehow is connected to non-Jewish practice, or to Jewish practice, but not necessarily our type of Judaism, our kind of Judaism. So this is something that we will have the opportunity to discuss while reading some of our sources. So it was very helpful, Marty. Does someone else want to share their feelings?
Barry, do you want to say something? I know you have an opinion.
Yeah, I had discussed this with you on Saturday. My feeling had been, I guess it still is, number one, if the congregation wanted to do it and they took a vote on it, fine. But I'm going back to what's happened in the past. It's just not, traditionally, it has not been done. The conservative movement has changed, and I realize they're changing, and it seemed to me that using musical instruments is more of a what do you call it, a way to getting us closer to reformism rather than to have conservatism. Of course, the Orthodox don't do it. I understand that. So I have felt that the actual use of musical instruments is already an affront on how conservative Judaism is supposed to move forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Barry. It is also very helpful. So Marty goes in the direction that it doesn't look Jewish. And Barry will say it looks Jewish, but not our kind of Judaism, not the Judaism we are accustomed with, we normally practice here at the congregation. It is really useful. Thank you so much, helpful. Thank you so much, Barry. Who else would like to share their thought?
Rabbi?
Yes, Ronnie.
Well, I grew up in an observant home, so of course there was no instruments. My kids did not play the piano. It was just not part of our religious life.
Okay, and how do you feel about it?
I have mixed feelings because my brother is a composer and writes Jewish music. And so I've been to some of his services that are really beautiful with instruments. I'm uncomfortable with it on a regular basis, but it sounds good.
Okay. Anyone else before we get to the sources? Yes, Judith and Irene.
So some of you may know that I grew up in a completely secular family. However, once in a while, for some reason, we would go to the Great Synagogue of Brussels, which is, for all intents and purposes, Orthodox. It's not ultra Orthodox, but it just is. It's not liberal in the sense that is used, outside of the United States. But I remember that they would use an organ, and they had a choir, and there was an organ. And this is a very traditional synagogue. And then my ex-brother-in-law is cantor at Temple Emmanuel in Providence, which is a conservative, kind of famous conservative synagogue. And on Yom Kippur, they have a tradition of using an organ. There is an organ in the shul, and they use it on Yom Kippur. So, it's interesting that these things are being done by people you would not expect would be using musical instruments. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Judith. So it means that those boundaries are not so strict. And sometimes you will find instrumental music in Orthodox synagogue, and you will find a Reformed synagogue that for one reason or another just decided not to have instruments on Shabbat or Yom Tov. And regarding to the conservative movement, this is a debate now, and there are some synagogues that have already decided to go for instrumentation on Shabbat, musical instruments on Shabbat. One very important synagogue of the conservative movement in Manhattan is Park Avenue, and Park Avenue, they do play instruments on Shabbat. So this is an example of a conservative synagogue that decided to do instrumentation on Shabbat. Different synagogues have decided not to do it, but this is a debate. But those boundaries are not that strict. Yes, Irene.
So I just wanted to say, Bruce, could you shut? I just wanted to say, he's got to shut his computer. Okay, I just wanted to say, Marty, I do agree with Marty. I find when the Hebrew prayers are translated to English, it rubs me the wrong way, and I do feel that I feel church-like. On music, I've been to synagogues in the city. B'nai Jeshurun's one that might not be part of the movement, but it considers itself conservative. And I've been there for many services, And the music is really a nice touch, and it adds a little life, a little more life. And being that I'm not observant, I don't find it an issue, but I wouldn't want to turn off people that come to us that are more observant. So, the idea of maybe once in a while makes sense, because then you're being more inclusive than exclusive.
Great. Thank you very much, Irene. Yes, Roberta.
I have to say I have mixed feelings about it. I grew up in a very traditional conservative home and synagogue where, musical instruments were frowned upon. There are a lot of things we didn't do on Shabbos, and one of those things was musical instruments. So it sort of feels in some way like we're moving closer to being a Reformed synagogue by having it. On the other hand, I can appreciate, the beauty of the instruments, and also the desire to attract more younger people and more of a diverse group of congregants. So I would be in favor of having it occasionally for special events, but perhaps not every week.
Thank you, Roberta. Anyone else? And so we have some arguments that are non-halachic. They are connected more connected to politics or to our feelings and to history, and just to the fact that we are not accustomed with music on Shabbat. But some of them are halachic, are very technical. And now I would like to transition a little bit to the halachic reasons that some people will decide not to do instruments on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and it will be an opportunity to deepen the conversation a little bit. So this is the first group of sources that I would like to share with you. It was prepared by the conservative yeshiva. So one argument is connected to carrying, the prohibition of carrying things on Shabbat, and deciding to do music with instruments on Shabbat could raise the chances of we would end up carrying instruments on Shabbat to take to the synagogue. So this is one of the concerns. So as we read here, Tiltul Daled Amot Birshut Arabim Veotza Mirshut Lirshut. Carrying 4 amot. 4 amot is like 2 meters in the public domain, and carrying from one domain to another. So there is this prohibition that we should not carry things on Shabbat, unless one lives in a community where there is a Tzurat Petach, commonly known as Eruv. It is forbidden, for example, to carry an object from one's house to the synagogue. This is the reason why we do not blow the shofar on Shabbat. So blowing the shofar on Shabbat is not forbidden. It's not prohibited. But we do not blow the shofar on Shabbat when Rosh Hashanah occurs on Shabbat, because we are afraid of someone carrying the shofar from their house to the synagogue. So this is the reason why we would not blow the shofar on Shabbat. The issue is not insurmountable. This is a word that I just learned trying to prepare this class. It's a very difficult word. As synagogues provide sidurim and talitot to the worshippers, they can also provide the musical instruments. So we might find a way to be sure that we will not carry the guitar or the flute or the clarinet and so on. As some people preferred to leave their own siddur or talit in the synagogue, the musician can also leave his or her instrument in a locked room in the shul prior to Shabbat. In communities or situations where fear of carrying is tangible, it might be a reason to look into having musical instruments on the regalim, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, and Rosh Hashanah when carrying is permitted. So this prohibition to carry things is for Shabbat only and for Yom Kippur, but not for the other holidays. On Simchat Torah, in particular, authorities have been more lenient about the possibility of clapping and dancing. We will get to the clapping and dancing thing because there is a prohibition of clapping and dancing on Shabbat. And clapping and dancing is connected to the prohibition of musical instruments. We will explain it when we get there. The second reason would be Zecher lechurban, memorial to the destruction of the temple. After the destruction of the second temple in the year 70, the rabbis enacted a number of measures to ensure that the people would be in mourning for the temple. One of them was to ban music altogether, not just on Shabbat and festivals. So that was this idea that we should not have music anymore because of the destruction of the temple. The Jewish people were never able to strictly uphold this ban. The stipulations were lightened or qualified over time. There are still some ultra-Orthodox Jews who will not attend a wedding in Jerusalem in which a band performs, but in almost all Jewish circles, weddings are by and large identified with instrumental song and dance. For Zionists, the reestablishment of the State of Israel has provided an additional reason to reinstitute music in all areas of celebration. So this is the second reason why some people will resist instruments on Shabbat. Third reason, Chukot Agoim, or Bechukoteim lo telechu. This is connected to what Marty said. The ways of the Gentiles, or in their ways you shall not go. When the organ was introduced into Reform synagogues in Germany in the 19th century, there was opposition to the effect that they were copying the practices of the churches. One could also state today that the Jews have got the idea of introducing other instruments into the shul because of exciting or moving musical worship services that they have seen or heard about in churches. However, one could also state that originally in the temple, we had musical instruments accompany our rituals. This was way before Christianity. We are simply returning to our true selves. So this is one argument that we could use against the idea that it looks very non-Jewish. We can say it looks non-Jewish because we just do not remember anymore what happened during the temple. It was originally very Jewish to have instruments on Shabbat, musical instruments on Shabbat, because this was the way that they celebrated Shabbat in the temple. Fourth, chashmal, electricity. This is, of course, a major issue. If electricity is forbidden, then the discussion can simply focus on the numerous non-electric instruments, unplugged. For those who permit electricity, as we do, because in our synagogue we do use microphone, we would also have to ask the question, we'd also have to ask the question, are all types of electricity permissible, including the machinery that accompanies rock bands, etc. As I mentioned, I think the most serious issue is Shema Yetaken, and we will get back to this one because this is a major issue. So the fear that one will fix an instrument during Shabbat. So if you use a guitar and you lose a string during the ceremony, you could decide to fix that string during Shabbat, and this would be a problem. We cannot fix instruments during Shabbat. This is also a concern. We will get back to that because it's connected to the clapping and dancing that I mentioned before. The world was completed in 6 days and God rested on the 7th day. Everything was in place. Likewise, we want everything to be ready for Shabbat. The rabbis placed fences in Hebrew. We call it siagim around the Torah to ensure that one would not come to fix anything. Are these fences still relevant? This is a question. So here we saw, just to summarize this part before we continue, 4 reasons why one should not use instruments on Shabbat. And as we also saw, each of those reasons is questionable. We can question whether they are really relevant to our lives. One is carrying, the other is the remembrance of the destruction of the temple, the third is the ways of the Gentiles, and the fourth is chashmal, electricity. Before I share the next document, I'd like to ask if is there any question or comment on the sources that we just read. No? Are we good? Yes, I see a hand. Sandy.
So Rabbi, if there's an Eruv where you live, and if you or if you leave this instrument in the synagogue and you your instrument, say, breaks and you don't fix it, is that anything wrong with that?
No, we actually will see that from the halachic standpoint, there is no prohibition whatsoever about playing instruments on Shabbat. All the prohibitions are around the actual playing. So things connected to fixing, to carrying, but not the actual play. So it's not forbidden, it's not prohibited by Jewish law to play instruments in Shabbat, during Shabbat, because if it was, they would not play it in the temple. The fact that they played instruments in the temple only shows that the playing itself is not forbidden. It's not prohibited. There are prohibitions that were created around, but playing itself is not a prohibition. It's not forbidden.
Thank you.
Okay? If you work those prohibitions somehow, if you solve those questions somehow, as you said, a place that there is an eruv, or you keep the instruments inside the synagogue, you take the decision that you are not fixing the instrument in case it breaks. You can always have a second guitar. If the first one breaks, you can get the second one and play. So there are ways to solve those concerns and then allow the play.
Thank you.
Sure. Please, important question. Any further comment before we move to the clapping and dancing and fixing instruments, because that is the most important halachic question regarding instruments. No? Can we proceed? Great. So I will share an additional source. Just a moment, please. So this is the one that I want to share. And once again, it is part of these several sources that were organized by the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem to study about musical instruments on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And here is the Mishnah that is important to our question. Any activity, I'm reading from the Mishnah, Tractate of Beitzah 36b. Any activity from which one is obligated to abstain because of rabbinical injunction. On the Shabbat, one is also obligated to abstain from it on Yom Tov. These are, one may not ascend a tree, nor ride upon an animal, nor swim in the water, not clap hands, nor slap on one's thigh, nor dance. So the part that is important to us, and those are all prohibitions that can lead us to a prohibition. So those are all fences. Those are all things that they are not prohibited by themselves. For instance, there is no problem in swimming in the water. But there are those who decide not to swim during Shabbat are preoccupied with other things that swimming might lead to. So ascending a tree is not forbidden on Shabbat. It's not a problem itself. But you cannot detach some parts of the tree, and ascending the tree could lead to detaching these parts of the tree. So those are all prohibitions that are not forbidden themselves, but could lead to another prohibition. But the important part for us here is the clapping and slapping and dancing, because these all are prohibitions that exist for the same reason, and we will see. Why is it prohibited to clap hands on Shabbat? Why is it prohibited to slap on one's thigh or dance on Shabbat? Because all of those activities could lead to fixing an instrument on Shabbat. So the clapping and dancing could lead to someone getting a guitar and playing, and a string may break, and you will need to fix an instrument on Shabbat. All of those prohibitions, those musical prohibitions, are connected to the fear that one might fix an instrument on Shabbat. And we will keep on reading a little bit. You see here, nor clap. I'm reading the last lines of this Gemara. Nor clap hands or slap, nor dance, decree, lest one will repair musical instruments. So the reason why we do not clap or slap or dance is lest one will repair musical instruments. So those are all activities connected to the idea that it will make it very inviting for someone to get an instrumental, a musical instrument and play, and it might break, and a string will eventually be fixed on Shabbat. I am proceeding a little bit. So, Tosfot. Tosfot are the grandchildren of Rashi. So if Rashi lived in the 11th century in France, the Tosfot lived 2 generations after. They were the grandchildren of Rashi, and they are very, very important commentators of the Talmud, and many times they debate with Rashi. They go against Rashi in several instances. So we taught in a Mishnah, one does not clap or dance. Rashi, so they are here quoting their grandfather. They are quoting Rashi. Rashi explained, lest one will repair a musical instrument. However, for us, so the grandchildren of Rashi, clapping and dancing are permitted. So the grandchildren are practicing a more liberal version of Judaism that their grandfather practiced. And we are not talking about last week. We are talking about the 11th century. So this whole idea that the new generations may, and I would say should, keep on debating about halakha and about how to make halakha relevant to their lives is a very old Jewish idea, because specifically in their days, when they were experts in making musical instrument, it was appropriate to make this decree. But for us who are not experts in making musical instrument, it is not appropriate to make this decree. So we, the grandchildren of Rashi, we don't even know how to make a musical instrument. So the clapping and dancing will not lead to fixing an instrument, because we do not have instruments and we do not know how to make them. Shulchan Aruch, this very important code from the 16th century, there are those who permit instructing a non-Jew to play a musical instrument at a wedding on Shabbat. So according to Shulchan Aruch, if the instrument is played by a non-Jew, it could be played even on Shabbat for a wedding. Again, Shulchan Aruch, one may not clap, strike one palm against the other, slap, strike one's thigh with one's palm, or dance, because the sages decreed a prohibition against all for fear that one may come to make or fix a musical instrument. And again, it's very, very important to highlight. None of them say that playing an instrument on Shabbat is forbidden. All of them are concerned with making an instrument or fixing an instrument. But none of them say that the playing itself is forbidden. Gloss, when we say the word gloss inside the Shulchan Aruch, it's because the Ashkenazic practice differs from the Sephardic practice, because the author of the Shulchan Aruch was Moshe Karu, and Moshe Karu lived in Tzfat in the 16th century, and he was Sephardic, so he knows the Sephardic laws. And whenever there is a difference between the Sephardic law and the Ashkenazic law, there is a gloss made by a Polish rabbi called Isserles. And the gloss here says, the reason why people clap and dance nowadays, and we do not protest against them, is because it is preferable that they transgress in ignorance and not intentionally, since they will not heed us in any case. However, there are those who maintain that all is permitted nowadays because we are not expert in making musical instruments, and there are no grounds for enacting a decree prohibiting it for fear that one may come to prepare a musical instrument, for it is not a common thing, and this is possibly why it has become the practice to be lenient with respect to all this. And this is the last source we will read here together. These words are very surprising, according with Aruch HaShulchan, one of the commentators of Shulchan Aruch. One of the commentators of Shulchan Aruch is called Aruch HaShulchan. There is a play of words here. These words are very surprising, for tying violin strings is very common. Likewise, winding them on the pegs. In other words, turning the peg in order to tune the instrument. And for both of these things, one must bring a sin offering because of tying and because of fixing a utensil. So I want to stop there again and just be sure that we are all on the same page here. So there are several halachic reasons that could be used to sustain the prohibition of musical instruments on Shabbat. But the most important of them is the prohibition of clapping and dancing on Shabbat, because it could take us to a situation in which we would make instruments, use them, and fix during Shabbat. So all of those sources reinforce the idea that playing instruments itself is not forbidden on Shabbat, but fixing them is prohibited. And because of the fear that one might fix instruments on Shabbat, some authorities decided to forbid instruments whatsoever, and some more severe authorities would say it is even forbidden to clap or to dance, because all of those are in the same category, and all of those together could lead to fixing instruments on Shabbat. Okay, before we proceed, I would like to hear your reactions on the clapping, dancing, and fixing thing. One at a time. Yes. Yes, please unmute yourself.
Okay. So one question though, is tuning a violin actually fixing a violin, or is it just tuning? Because all string instruments need to be tuned. And if so,
Yes.
there's many other instruments that don't even have strings. And you haven't even mentioned those, like, well, the, air instruments and the drums and stuff like that. And I just want to say I'm really good with having this discussion because I love it. I love learning. I feel that we follow so many things without understanding, and I just love understanding. And I think it's a shame that we never had this opportunity in the past. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the feedback. It may be a shame, but the time arrived, and we are here together studying, and it's endless. Judaism is so much knowledge and content that we can always learn something new. Regarding the tuning itself is not forbidden, as playing is not forbidden. The prohibition is to fix. When you tune an instrument, or when you play an instrument, you might eventually break a string, and the fear is connected to the fixing. Fixing would be making something prohibited on Shabbat, but not playing, not tuning, not clapping, not dancing, but somehow the rabbis put all of them in the same group. Yes. Anyone else?
So Rabbi, is that really the only prohibition? Is there
No.
a further argument against what you that would counter your argument?
No, we saw several other prohibitions. This is the most relevant of them. We saw the prohibition of carrying on Shabbat. We saw the prohibition for those who do not use electricity in using electric instruments on Shabbat. We saw the prohibition of, we saw several other prohibitions, but again, none of them actually prohibits the playing, prohibits the instrument themselves. All of them are fences that in order to avoid getting closer to fixing or to carrying or to and so on. But this is not the only concern. There are other concerns, as we saw, but each of them relates to something around playing and not to the playing itself. Is it clear, Marty?
Yes. One
Okay.
other question.
Yes, please.
If there was music in the very early days of the temple, what was the reason that it may have been phased out?
Sorry,
I assume at some point, music that existed long ago got faded out somehow, either halakhically or based on just, tradition or whatever. That would cause us to think that music sounds like it's in a church.
So I think that the distance that we today have in regard to the temple and to everything that happened in the temple makes it difficult for us to remember or to refer to what happened then. But we know for sure by the Jewish sources that this was the practice. Once the temple was destroyed, we saw they tried to forbid music whatsoever, and to say it is forbidden to sing and to dance because we are now mourning for the temple. But this is a prohibition that was never really observed. But the part of this prohibition that remained was the prohibition to play instruments in Shabbat and Yom Tov. So this is somehow connected to the destruction of the temple and to the idea that we should mourn and that our lives will not be the same without the temple. Is it
Very
clear, Mark?
interesting is all I can say.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Rabbi?
anyone else? Yes.
I
Ronnie.
have an issue with this. And I'm going back to Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof when he says it's tradition. We are putting tradition completely aside and not valuing it. And I have a real hard time with that. That's all. I just had to say it.
Thank you,
Rabbi?
Ronnie. I think this is a very, very, very important comment. So before who has called us?
I wanted to make a comment.
On what Ronnie just said?
Yeah, tradition, again, the only
Okay.
tradition, but the reason with an instrument breaking, it looks to me, again, just my thought, that someone had to find a reason and they came up with an instrument possibly breaking. I just think it, not that it's far-fetched, but I just think it's not part of realization and realization thinking of what should be. How you come up with, well, the instrument could break, you're clapping. That is almost, because you're clapping, you're going to break an instrument. It just doesn't sit well.
Because those fences really don't sit well. Do you know why an Orthodox woman will not shake hands with a man that is not her husband?
It could lead
Do you
to
know why?
dancing.
Yes, because they can end up having a prohibited sexual relationship. Does it sit well, Barry?
What?
It does not sit well because we are talking here about a sort of thought that you, according to this ultra orthodoxy, you should build fences and another fence around the fence and another fence around the fence. And then you will be sure that people will be far enough from committing a sin, from doing something that is prohibited. But when you start make fences around fences, you lose the connection with the initial reason why you are doing it. When you say that shaking hands may lead to someone to have sexual intercourse, for me, it's absolutely crazy. But I respect those who decide not to do it. But there is no prohibition in Judaism in shaking hands.
Okay, I'm just coming back to my initial comment. To come up for a reason why musical instruments will not be allowed or would be allowed because of clapping causing the instrument to break, I think is somebody had to come up with a reason and came up with that. I just don't see any realization in that comment or in that ruling. People are going to clap. I could very much doubt that it's going to break an instrument. So somebody had to have a reason. They came up with this. I probably could have come up with some better explanations, but I just don't think this holds weight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see it, and I agree with you. I think that clapping and fixing instrument are far from each other, as shaking hands and having a sexual relationship are far from each other. But this is a kind of relationship that the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox reading of our tradition made, those kind of connections. I see that Lisa wants to say something, and I still want to comment on Roni, because I think the tradition comment is very important. Yes, Lisa.
Yeah, I actually have two things to say, of course. The first one is, I think we're not having a discussion that is very important, and that is, why were there musical instruments in the temple? What did it add? What beauties, what spirit, what joy did it add to worship that made it part of the temple service? And how sad it is that we have lost that. Knowing that there were musical instruments in the temple clearly indicates to me that it was clear that music adds to worship in every possible way. The second thing is, I respect the argument about tradition, but as the first girl in my synagogue who had a bat mitzvah back in, we don't even talk about it, 1960, when it was on a Friday night and I could not read Torah, although I sang a half Torah, and people got up and walked out when I did that, not many, but some, the argument about tradition is not strong to me if you can show that there is a previous tradition that completely contradicts the current tradition. I never heard musical instruments in that synagogue. But had I lived 6,000 years ago, I would have. So where's the tradition?
Thank you. And I would like to comment on tradition and on the reasons why we would bring instruments to the synagogue. So regarding tradition, what is tradition? Oh, tradition is something that now is known to us, but that at some point came to replace a previous tradition. What do you call tradition? If you say tradition is not to have instruments on Shabbat, but this is a tradition that replaced the tradition of having instruments on Shabbat in the temple. So traditions are always being created, and they are canceling the previous tradition. And so tradition is what we know, or our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. What is tradition? Once back in Brazil, I said by the end of that service, now we will sing Adon Olam. What melody would you like us to sing? And some woman raised her hand and said, the traditional one. The tradition to who? There are so many melodies for Adon Olam. Which tradition? And every family has a tradition, and every synagogue has a tradition, and we have several different traditions. So the tradition of Reform synagogues since the 19th century is to play instruments during Shabbat and holidays. But the previous tradition was not to play. For BJ, as Irene said, instruments on Shabbat is a very important part of their Shabbat experience. And probably they were one of the first synagogues in the US to start this tradition. But for them, this is tradition. They have now several generations that were raised with music on Shabbat. And if you ask them, what is the tradition? They will say the tradition is to play music on Shabbat. This is tradition. So what is tradition is an important question. And as regarding to the positive things, what does music add to Shabbat? In my opinion, it adds a lot to synagogue experience. Again, my reference is my hometown congregation, my home community. And we used to have, we had 300 people every Kabbalat Shabbat, singing and praying together. And I would say that one of the main reasons why so many people came to Shabbat back in my home synagogue is because of music. The music was a very, very central part, a very important part of that experience. And I will say something to you, it was not because of the food, because we did not have anything after service. We had only challah and wine, and that's it. So I understand food is a very important factor to bring people to synagogue, but music is also a very, very key, a very, very central addition, in my opinion, to a service. It makes a service much nicer, and it communicates, to my opinion, with the younger generations. So when I ask this congregation to revisit its tradition and to do an experience as we are doing this coming Shabbat, we are trying something. We are doing an experiment. We are trying something this coming Shabbat, and we will have music on Shabbat morning, is to try to understand what Lisa is saying, that there is a potential there, there is an addition there. And as part of this process, I think that learning and studying and questioning and arguing is important, as it is very important just to share our feelings. Barry, the way we feel about something is important, and it's Jewish too. The way we feel about something is important, because sometimes our rationale and our stomach do not go together. And when my previous congregation became egalitarian, I had several people coming to me and saying, I understand, but I cannot stand. I understand, but it's difficult to me, because this is not our tradition. So when do you want to face and to revisit and to break tradition? And where do you want to hide behind tradition? This is an important question. When this congregation decided to go egalitarian, it decided to break a tradition. What was the tradition here before being egalitarian? Was not allowing women to read from the Torah, and not to count women for minyan, and not to say imaot in the Amida, and so on and so forth. This was the tradition. But at some point, it was broken. And you know what? If you would not revisit traditions, we would keep on doing sacrifices in our backyards. We are not doing sacrifices in our backyards because at some point we revisited the tradition. The tradition back then was to sacrifice animals, and we are not doing it. So Judaism is alive because we are revisiting our traditions. Does it mean breaking with everything? No, but seeking a healthy balance between tradition and modernity. Where is this line? we will keep on discussing and debating forever. Does someone have any additional comment to share? Okay, so thank you very much, and Laila Tov.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.